What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. Today, I'm going to be covering day 3 of Packers training camp, Packers practice, which was not open to the public, and I can clearly understand why that decision was made. Matt LaFleur mentioned pre-practice that this was going to be a walkthrough and just a shorter practice, and it was less than an hour and a half, and saying it was a walkthrough would probably be pretty generous. This practice was at a snail's pace, just sort of going through the motions, more mental reps than anything else, which is, by the way, smart. And I totally agree with, Matt LaFleur and what he's trying to accomplish here by making sure the guys get the necessary rest that they need and how they want to accomplish everything that they want to accomplish. So I think this was the right decision by Matt LaFleur, but it was very clear to me why they went with no fans and just sort of went through a nice, easy walkthrough for this practice. But we still had some takeaways that I think are worth discussing here. I didn't do a quick takeaways episode today because there just wasn't that much overall to discuss. And quite frankly, that would have been my entire episode for today. So we'll jump into it right away. The first thing is that we had 4 players return from injury, and I think that is definitely noteworthy. So Sammy Watkins, Randy Ramsey, Akil Byers, and Rasheed Walker all returned from injury. And granted, Sammy Watkins is probably the only big name there, but Randy Ramsey has gone through incredible lengths to get back from injury. He's had a couple different procedures done. He was one of their top special teams players and could still factor in as the Packers' potential number 3 edge rusher. So that is a big return. We'll see what Akil Byers can bring to the table. And anytime you draft somebody, I don't care if it's in the first round or 7th round, you want to be able to see them and see what they can do ultimately. So it was great to see Rasheed Walker back at practice as well. So 4 total returns. That leaves Mason Crosby, Christian Watson, Keyshawn Nixon, Kylan Hill, David Bakhtiari, Elton Jenkins, Robert Tonyan, and Malik Taylor as the only Packers that are not practicing. Some big names there still, but we're dwindling the list down day by day. And as of right now, as of this moment, only 8 Green Bay Packers that are not practicing in some capacity. So that's not terrible overall, even though some of the names on that list, including Tonyan, Jenkins, Bakhtiari, Christian Watson, Mason Crosby, even to a lesser extent, Keyshawn Nixon and Kylan Hill, definitely have some level of importance to this team. So we'll see when some of these players can get back. Hopefully Green Bay gets a couple more of these back sooner rather than later, but we'll definitely be keeping an eye on the overall injury status as camp continues and as we head into practice on Saturday. We had another change along the offensive line. Yosh Nijman at left tackle, back at left tackle from being at right tackle. Still John Runyon Jr. and Josh Myers, and then Jake Hansen was back at right guard, and Royce Newman was back at right tackle. Zach Tom was back with the number 2s, and we finally saw Cole Van Lanen get some snaps with the 1s for the first time in training camp. We saw that in mini camps, we saw that in OTAs, but for the first time in training camp, we saw Cole Van Lanen get some reps both at right guard and right tackle. So again, Zach Tom back with the 2s, Cole Van Lanen gets some work with the 1s, Yosh back at left, Newman back at tackle, Hansen back starting at right guard. This is clearly a work in progress, and understandably so, right? Anytime you lose your top 2 offensive linemen in Elton Jenkins and David Bakhtiari, you're going to have to figure out what you're going to do with those absences. And right now, Green Bay's clearly trying to figure out who can fill those spots, what's their best lineup. And it's going to have to be something that Matt LaFleur really navigates, right? As well as Adam Stenavich and Luke Butkus, because you don't want to get to a point where all of a sudden you have players who haven't had enough reps at a given position, right? So you don't want to get like Royce Newman, who may end up, like if all of a sudden Jenkins is back at right tackle and Bakhtiari's back at left tackle, Newman is probably at right guard, right? But you don't want him to spend a bunch of time at right tackle if he's not going to end up there. At the same token, you want to be able to cross-train some of these players. So there's this really big balancing act of like trying to figure out what offensive line works best, but the longer it takes you to get there, the less consistency these players get. I remember talking to Brian Bulaga in the locker room one time, and he really stressed like the importance of having reps with the guys next to you and knowing what they're going to do and going over and over how you're going to have double teams and how you pass off things and that level of communication. And if, day by day you have all of these rotating players, that can be sort of distracting and it can be detrimental in some way too. So I'm not saying it is now, and Green Bay's done a tremendous job with moving players around along the offensive line. At the end of the day, sort of block the guy in front of you sort of thing. And I think Green Bay's philosophy on this has been really, really good, and it served them well more often than not. But it is going to be something to really just continue to keep an eye on, because I don't think Green Bay has a great idea of who's going to be their left tackle, right guard, and right tackle if Bakhtiari and Jenkins aren't ready to go week 1. So that is going to be a continuing storyline as we continue on with training camp. Meanwhile, on the defensive side of the ball, I thought we saw one of the really fun formations that I've been looking forward to that we hadn't seen yet. So when Green Bay has gone nickel so far in camp, they've gone with a 3-3-5 version of it. It's a 3-3-5, but it's basically acting as like a 5-1-5. So in theory, you have 3 defensive linemen, 2 edge rushers, and a linebacker within 5 defensive backs in what it's been so far, right? So it looks like a 3-3-5 on paper if you're counting, your 2 outside linebackers and Gary and Preston as outside linebackers. But really in that formation, they're edge rushers, and then you've got 3 defensive linemen up front. So it's really 5, players up on the line, on the line of scrimmage. So 5 players up front. I would consider it more a 5-1-5 than with Devondre Campbell at linebacker, and then your normal 3 corners and your 2 safeties, right? On Friday, we saw a 2-4-5, or I guess you could say a 4-2-5 if you want to look at it my way. But either way, Dean Lowry and Kenny Clark along the defensive line. We also saw Jerron Reed in this formation in for Dean Lowry. They sort of switched spots at times, but Clark and another defensive lineman, Lowry or Jerron Reed. Then Preston Smith and Rashawn Gary at edge. Quay Walker and Devondre Campbell at linebacker with your same 3 corners, Jair Stokes-Douglas, and your 2 safeties, Amos and Savage. So basically flopping out a defensive lineman instead of going with 3 defensive linemen, adding in an extra inside linebacker, in this case, Quay Walker. Really like the potential of that lineup. I mean, you just go Clark, Lowry, Preston, Gary, Quay, Campbell, Jair, Stokes, Douglas, Amos, Savage. That is a heck of an 11-man group. And I already saw on Twitter, like, a lot of people wondering, like, well, where's Devonte Wyatt? Well, like, what's going on? Why is he not the number 2? First of all, I think a lot of people really missed how good Dean Lowry was playing towards the second half of last season, really after week 4 last year. He played some really good football. Second, you don't want to have to put your rookies in positions where they need to play a ton right away. If Devonte Wyatt gets to be a rotational defensive player, from day 1, where he can come in and play 20 snaps and hopefully play them at a high level and start showing some of those flashes, that's a great role for him to begin with. And I think that's where we're at. I think the fact that this defensive line has Kenny Clark, Dean Lowry, TJ Slayton, Jerron Reed, and Devonte Wyatt, 5 really good players, and then add in maybe even a Jonathan Ford as a rotational player who could play, 8 to 10 snaps in rundown situations, assuming he makes the team, of course. I really, really like that group as a defensive line, and it makes sense to me. Lowry should be in that spot right now. Jerron Reed should be in that spot. Those guys are veteran players who know exactly what to do in those situations, and it's going to take Devonte Wyatt time to learn the tricks of the trade and his craft and really, sort of dig out some of those snaps for himself, right? He's going to get there. I don't think there's any concern about that. He's going to get snaps in the rotation, and he is going to be a big part of this defense. But to begin with, let Lowry and Reed sort of man the starting positions, and Slayton even a little bit too, and let Devonte Wyatt sort of grow at his own pace. I think that's the best case scenario for Devonte Wyatt right now. For the first time in training camp, even though this is just walkthrough, we had the team separate into the 1s and the 2s, 2 different sides of the field. And as I kind of talked about yesterday, you have to basically choose which one you want to watch. So for the most part, everyone was watching the 1s. I think Aaron Nagler went down and watched the 2s, or a couple other people down watching the 2s. But for the most part, everyone's watching the 1s. But what I wanted to do was see who were all the players that were practicing with the 1s. Now, it should be noted right away, this is walkthroughs. And 2, more importantly, in some situations, it is more beneficial to actually be working and getting all the snaps with the 2s than getting some snaps with the 1s. For example, let's take Devonte Wyatt. And he's a great example of that, right? On the defensive side, they're switching, 4 guys around with the 1s and sort of mixing up snaps. And there's 2 defensive linemen. So you're kind of just getting like 50% of the snaps sometimes. Meanwhile, on the other side, Devonte Wyatt's going to get almost all of the snaps with the 2. So he actually gets more snaps by being down with the 2s. Another great example of this is Chris Barnes, right? If Chris Barnes was down with the 1s, he would have probably not got almost any snaps. He wouldn't have been able to call any plays. But if he's down with the twos, he's the one that's calling all the plays and getting almost every snaps with the linebackers. I would argue it's much more beneficial for Barnes to be down with the twos than it would be to be stuck behind Quay Walker and Devondre Campbell with the ones. So you want to get some of these guys reps. Zach Tom is another great example of this, where you want him taking every rep with the twos rather than rotating with Cole Van Lanen and everyone else with the ones. So just because a player didn't get with the ones doesn't mean that they're not at some point going to be a part of the game plan, or maybe even starting, at some point this season. So, but here were the players at the ones. Along the defensive line, Dean Lowry, Kenny Clark, Jerron Reed, and TJ Slayton, which means, again, Devontae Wyatt was down with the twos. At edge, Rashawn Gary, Preston Smith, Ladarius Hamilton, and Tipa Naliai. Linebacker, Devondre Campbell, Quay Walker, and Ray Wilborn, which is a callback from minicamp when Wilborn also got time with the ones in this situation. Eric Stokes, Jair Alexander, and Rasul Douglas at corner. Adrian Amos, Darnell Savage, Sean Davis, and Vernon Scott with the safeties. So an interesting group there. The big sort of names missing, Devontae Wyatt, Chris Barnes. That's probably it. Those are the only two names that you're probably like, that's interesting. I think the Ray Wilborn inclusion without Chris Barnes, and that's why I really wanted to clarify, because I think you can make an argument that, Wyatt and Barnes actually benefited by being down with the twos. I could have also made the same argument with Vernon Scott, though, that he would have probably been better off getting a bunch of snaps with the twos on the other side rather than just getting spot snaps for Savage and Amos with the ones. But interesting nonetheless. On the offensive side of the ball, Aaron Rodgers at quarterback, Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon at running back, Lazard, Cobb, Watkins, Dobbs, and Winfrey with the wide receivers, Tyler Davis, Mercedes Lewis, and Josiah DeGuara with the tight ends, Yosh Nijman, John Runyon Jr., Josh Myers, Jake Hansen, Royce Newman, and Cole Van Lanen along the offensive line. So those were all the players that got to practice with the ones. Everyone else was down with the twos unless they were injured, of course. The other key takeaway here, and this may sound really boring because it's special teams, but you want to start talking about back of the roster players who are likely to make a 53-man roster. Pay attention to the names on this list, because if you are on the number one kickoff team and if you are on the number one kick return team, you have a much more likely chance that you are actually going to make the roster. So here were the number one kick return team and kickoff team. These were per Ryan Wood. So first of all, the kick return team, the first line was Chris Barnes, Josiah DeGuara, Isaiah McDuffie. So that's a name to know there that, sort of back of the roster player, Shamar Jean-Charles, and then Rasul Douglas. The next line was Tyler Davis, Dominique Daphne, and Tipa Naliai. And then A.J. Dillon and Juwan Winfrey were the next group. And then the returner itself was actually Rico Gafford. And then there was a lot of different players that returned, including Romeo Dobbs. Aaron Jones got some return time as well, Amari Rogers. So they're still working through that, but Rico Gafford was the first one up as a returner. And then the kickoff team consisted of Rico Gafford, Dallin Levitt, Tipa Naliai, Tariq Carpenter, Adrian Amos, Isaiah McDuffie, Chris Barnes, Sean Davis, Shamar Jean-Charles, Eric Stokes, and then, of course, the kicker, Gabe Burgich. So some names that were on both included Rico Gafford, Tipa Naliai, Isaiah McDuffie, Chris Barnes, Shamar Jean-Charles. So those are 5 names to keep a very close eye on, because if they are on the number one kickoff and the number one kick return team, that could really increase their odds of making it as one of the back-end players on the 53-man roster. The other quick note here, there was no stars of the camp on Friday. It was just in so slow motion. There's nothing going on. It's individual drills and then just literally snail's pace walkthroughs. But even in a walkthrough, even when there's nothing going on, and they still throw the ball. Tyler Davis is over the middle. Rodgers just throws it. Ball goes off Tyler Davis's hands. Who does the ball pop right to? Rasul Douglas, because of course it does. The dude is a ball magnet no matter what. I don't care if it's defense or in a game, I should say, in training camp, through walkthroughs, the ball just finds a way to Rasul Douglas, and his knack for finding interceptions continues even in a walkthrough period. If you can have a tough day at the office in walkthroughs, Tyler Davis had a little bit of a tough day. It was really just back-to-back plays. On the first play, it looked like he was misaligned. He was the one that had to move in and was sort of in the wrong spot. And then Aaron Rodgers kind of signaled for a timeout, even in a walkthrough. It was just kind of like a fake timeout. But Davis looked like he was lined up in the wrong spot. And then was the next play where, even though it's not really live and you're not running, you still jog down the field. And then Rodgers threw him the ball. It goes right off his hands and was picked by Rasul Douglas. So a little bit of a tough day for Tyler Davis. Nothing that really matters. But if there was anything, if there is any such thing as a poor day on a walkthrough, Tyler Davis at least had a little bit of one. last but not least, I've been asked a lot about Kingsley Enagbare. I haven't heard anything about Kingsley. I haven't heard about anything. Well, it's because he hasn't done anything. And if there is a rookie that just from OTAs and minicamps that I just felt like, just looking at him, looks like he probably needs to put on some functional strength and he's going to need a little bit of time to develop, I think that's Kingsley Enagbare. And I wouldn't expect a ton in year one from him. I'm not saying he couldn't. I'm not saying he can't surprise. I'm not saying that as the year goes on, he couldn't get better and better and better. I just think right now it's probably going to be a tall ask for him to be one of the top rotational edge rushers at this point. So not ruling it out entirely. We're still very early. Maybe once just as much as a player can maybe come back to life when the pads come on. We've been talking about Romeo Doubs and saying, hey, let's pump the brakes and see what happens when the pads come on and we get to preseason, regular season, etc. The same can go the other way around. Some players don't get fired up or aren't playing at their best until they actually get the pads on. And maybe that's the case with Kingsley Enagbare. Maybe once he gets those pads on, he gets a little bit more juiced up and the skills start flowing and he starts making an impact. Could easily be the case. But as of right now, I think it's a little bit of a stretch to say Enagbare will have any major impact in year one, but it is still so early. Just as much as it's early for Romeo Doubs to start crowning him as the next big thing, it's way too early to say anyone's not going to be, a major part of the roster this upcoming season. But just looking at Enagbare and just some of his work so far, I just think that it's going to take a little time. I'm very high on Enagbare still. I think he's going to be a good player down the line. I just think he might be a little bit more of a developmental player that could maybe peak in year 2, year 3, a little bit more in year 1. That's going to do it for me today. I'll be right back here tomorrow with an all-new episode covering Saturday's practice, which will be in shells for the first time, and then Monday we'll get into pads. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.